Hi, this is Paul, and I said I'd continue with the biblical series. I better make good with that. I probably will mess up, but we'll keep going with it. Part of the difficulty of doing these commentaries is that the videos of Jordan stay the same, but I don't. And I've continued my own journey, talking to different ones of you, listening to Vervaeke. Lately, I've been taking a deep dive into Rene Girard and thinking about him. I had a conversation with someone about Owen Barfield again today. That got me thinking about that. I'm talking to Mark Vernon tomorrow about Owen Barfield, and I might be talking to Jeff Quackenbush again, which will be fun. I like talking to Jeff. I know some of you don't like me talking to Jeff, but that's okay. And so, and I come back around to Peterson's biblical series, and this is, I think, a really important series. And this, of all the videos, this is the one that people mentioned the first time. The, the idea of God, which is probably something that I haven't made enough comment on in terms of, well, that's just obvious, and it wasn't obvious to me, but Peterson has continued to talk about the idea of God. Now, part of what I've been working through and thinking about, obviously, is John Vervaeke's Relevance Realization, and trying to figure out how the John Vervaeke representation in my head and the Jordan Peterson representation in my head and the material that they put out, how they can both coexist in one head and how they fit together. And there's that conversation from 2015 of those two talking, which was really quite a good one. And there was apparently another more formal debate that John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson had done earlier that was not recorded. You got to record stuff, folks. You got to record stuff. You never get a second chance to record stuff. So, if you think it might have significance and others might see it, there's obviously lots of things that are not appropriate for recording, but, record some of that stuff. So I'm thinking about relevance realization and Darwin and relevance realization and how this stacks up with the idea of God and the frames that I've been thinking about lately, and the video I did on Hubert Dreyfus and frames and all of this stuff. And so when I swing all the way back to Jordan's biblical series, it's with all of these things that I listen to it now, and so my commentary is different. It's the old Greek idea: you never step into the same river twice, and you don't even step into the same river once. It's just the way it goes with human beings. And now I got a dry throat, and my water isn't here. Now I'm going to pick up pretty much where I left off before, where he starts talking about Jung. I've actually been doing a lot of thinking about this before we get into it, especially with how Peterson's talk about the idea of God intersects with Vervaeke's relevance realization. And I made the comment to John when I had my last conversation with him about a black box, and maybe that wasn't really fair. And because I think we can penetrate to a degree what it means for human beings to practice their relevance realization in a context that is so full of other human beings. Now, one of the things that Jordan makes reference to is Jordan did a video of basically a five section video for Easter 2018 that is no longer up. And I don't know why it's no longer up. It's too bad, because it was a good video. And he talked about sacrifice, and that's something that I'm very much going to come around to when I do more work on Rene Girard, because Rene Girard and Peterson kind of come together in some interesting ways. And the more Girard I listen to, and the better I understand Girard, and the better I understand Peterson, they really are intersecting in some interesting ways. And now I know a lot of people during I think the Peterson heyday was sort of between 2016 and mid 2018, when his wife got sick and he ended the book tour, and so we'll see if there's a second chapter when Jordan releases his next book and comes out of the hospital, so on and so forth. But a lot of people were saying, oh, you should intersect with the work of Rene Girard. The difficulty is that status binds and blinds. And if you're having the kind of demand that Jordan Peterson was having, it's really hard to start learning another significant body of work like that of Rene Girard. And so, and not only to learn it, but to be able to integrate it, because integration of this kind of stuff takes a fair amount of time. But Peterson, well, why don't I play a little bit of it and then I'll talk about.
See, I also spent a lot of time reading Carl Jung, and it was through Jung and also Jean Piaget, who's a developmental psychologist, that I started to understand that our articulated systems of thought are embedded in something like a dream, and that dream is informed in a complex way by the way we act.
Okay, so articulated systems of thought are embedded in something like a dream. That's how we structure them. Now, I had a really good conversation earlier this week with a young man from the UK that I should have pulled up. I wrote it down when he said it because it was a really good quote. He basically talked about how art is our way of knowing that bridges between the world and value. And he said that. I was like, I'm typing that thing. I'm typing that up. And I've sent him the video, and we'll see if he wants to share it. And again, when I do conversations with people, I've had a lot of conversations with people lately that haven't wanted to share, which is totally appropriate. But sometimes it isn't appropriate to share, but other times, it is. And human beings are amazing. And John Vervaeke has had a very similar experience that I've had, that so many of you who write and reach out and have conversations have so many interesting things to say and so many good observations, and I'm just so thoroughly enriched by all of this. In fact, I'm so enriched by it often I can't even keep up with so many of the good things that you send me. But Jordan Peterson says in that Easter video that part of the reason sacrifice works is that the future is so full of human beings that relating to it as a human being is, he says something like this, that it's a fairly savvy way to go about it. But now, what Peterson's referencing Jung and Piaget here, the world is so full of other human beings that a huge part of what we need in terms of our relevance realization is knowing how to deal with other human beings. And because the machine code of human beings is story and narrative, it only makes sense that we're processing all of these interactions, all of these relationships. We're processing them in sort of a dream state. And we know that with dreams, that we have dreams. If you had a significant thing during the day, you might dream about it at night. And if you're studying a book, you'll dream about it at night. And so we know that as little as we know about our dreams, we know that it has something to do with memory and processing. And maybe it's, taking things from unmapped territory to mapped territory and all of this. But as I mentioned in a conversation I had today with a woman, we do this with each other, okay? And whereas if you look at Jordan Peterson talking to Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson is very much trying to help Sam realize and integrate the filter through which we process this external world around us. And in a sense, the way that filter creates the world around us through filtering it through consciousness. It's vitally important to remember that filter is mostly made up of stuff from other human beings, from the religious context that we grew up in and the cultural context. And I love the way Brett Weinstein talked about we not only have the genetic code, but we have a culture code. And human beings are as dead in some ways without a culture code as your PC would be without an operating system. And what that culture code is made up of is all of the experiences, significance, meanings, values, all of this stuff sort of has to get encoded and crunched. Well, what's the best way to crunch it? Well, the best way to crunch it is, in a sense, into remembered action. Okay, this is where Peterson is going with this, into remembered action, because there's so much information in a tiny little thing that we do that we if we had to list it all and line it all up, you get that combinatorial, explosive nature that John Vervaeke talks about. And so in action, worlds of information are compressed into that action. And you know this if you know a person very well, or are living with a person, because if you notice in your family that just a look from a spouse or a father or a mother or a child or a church member or a friend, just a look means a world of things, and whole worlds flood in just with that look. Now we have to manage, and we really do very well, amazingly well. We manage all of this information, but all of this information has to be compressed somehow into something that is not physical, into the mind. The mind has to take it all in there. Well, how do we do it? Well, we do it in images and stories. Right now, I haven't had a chance to see the movie The Joker, but Jonathan Peugeot just did a video on it, and it's killing me. I'm begging my wife, honey, we got to go see this movie because Jonathan Peugeot did a video, and I want to talk about it. I want to listen. I'm protecting myself from the spoilers. But in a movie, there's worlds of information compressed into something, and good art, real art, is that way. And deep inside of us, we know it. But even if it doesn't make this little plane of consciousness that we live in. And what Peterson has said basically before minute 16 here in the video is that the way he thinks about the Bible is that is just so much stuff from thousands and thousands and thousands of years compressed into that. And I'll add on to a little bit of what he says here in terms of his thought, that this is battle tested and refined, and we don't even know where this comes from, but we know it's potent because out there in the world, people act like it's important and meaningful. You can go into how many homes in the world and you can find Bibles there. And you might say, oh, that was just because of power or propaganda. But, well, there's a lot of copies of Chairman Mao's Red Book, but I don't think it's going to have the durability that the Bible has had. And people aren't going to do commentaries like these on Chairman Mao's Red Book. And so there's something, whether or not I'm going to play the atheist card here, whether or not you believe there's anything supernatural about the book, just what has happened with that book over the scope of human history is truly amazing. And Peterson knows this. And so he's saying, in a sense here, there's way too much data in the world for us to deal with. Okay, that gets into the frame problem. There's way too much data in the world for us to deal with. And so we compress it, and we compress it in action, and we compress it in narrative, and we compress it in art, and we compress it in dreams. And when we compress it in that way, somehow we're able to manage it and to interact with it and to sift it and to sort it and to somehow manage value, which is where does value live? He gets talking about that with Sam Harris. And again, that word value even has so many different dimensions. When you say the value of Elvis's guitar, well, you're even just scratching the surface on value. So all of this stuff is going on. And so then he mentions Jung. And Jung, of course, I don't know a lot about Jung, but I've tried to educate myself a little bit about Jung. But one of the things that struck me immediately from his biography was this, and I've spoken about it often, was the moment when he's working as a doctor in an insane asylum, and the other doctors say, well, don't talk to the patients. They're crazy. You can't do anything for them. We just basically house them here. That's what we do. And Jung's like, well, I'm a doctor. What am I supposed to do? So he starts talking to the patients. He begins to, we see pattern recognitions. He begins to notice the patterns that are developing, not only in terms of stories from multiple patients, but the patterns within the religious context of the people, because he grew up as a Reformed pastor's son. And he noticed the patterns here, and he's noticing this, and he's saying, this isn't random, this isn't chaotic, there's things at work and things at play here. And it's really important, because if all is not well in our dreamscape, we are not able to act out well in the world. And so that's where Jung and then Piaget later, they come into this conversation. And so Peterson, I think, rightly sees that, well, the Bible is really important in this conversation because the Bible has made up it's in a sense been the operating system for different cultures all over the world. And now it isn't like an operating system where Windows 10 just runs Windows 10 or Mac OS Catalina just came out, just runs Mac OS Catalina. There's all these different permutations because there are cultural aspects that come into an individual family dynamics and personality. It's just enormously complex. But the Bible has been in this mix for so long that in a way, and even Richard Dawkins has noticed this. Richard Dawkins was lamenting that English school children weren't learning the Bible anymore, because even Richard Dawkins, who thinks that there's all kinds of problems with the Bible, you can't participate in this long line of Western culture without it. And now the Bible is penetrating India and Africa and China. And so to ignore this thing, you ignore it as your peril. So let's listen to Jordan talk a little bit more.
So, we act out things we don't understand all the time. And if that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't need a psychology or a sociology or an anthropology or any of that, because we would be completely transparent to ourselves. And we're clearly not. So we're much more complicated than we understand, which means that the way that we behave contains way more information than we know. And part of the dream that surrounds our articulated knowledge has been extracted as a consequence of us watching each other behave and telling stories about it for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, extracting out patterns of behavior that characterize humanity and trying to represent them partly through imitation, but also through drama and mythology and literature and art and all of that, to represent what we're like so that we can understand what we're like. And
now again, to represent what we're like. Now, if you go to Mary Cohen's channel, Mary's been, she hasn't made a lot of videos, but they're good videos. And Mary's a really smart woman, and she's got a lot of ideas, and she's fun to listen to. So listen to Mary. And she talks about propositional truth, where it's there's always two things with this, and you get into Jonathan Peugeot's left hand and right hand stuff, but we have to represent things so we can kind of distance it from ourselves. It's a little bit of self-transcendence as it sense, and we distance it from ourselves so that we can look at it, so that we can manipulate it, so that we can play with it in terms of our mind, and in terms out into the world we can try things, and we have to separate it from ourselves so that, well, in a sense, it can die and not us. That's what Peterson always talks about, ideas. But we have to. This is how we begin to work on these things. And so we create these representations. And sometimes we use our body to represent things, and sometimes we use paint and canvas, or sometimes we use words, or we're doing all of these things to kind of set it apart from ourselves so that we can play with it and figure out then how to reintegrate it into ourselves. And in a sense, that way we're always using programming to tinker with the programming. So maybe a little bit of a forgiveness from Brett Weinstein with what I just said there, but we're always doing this, but we're not terribly conscious doing it, even that we're doing it. In fact, I've never had exactly the thought that I had right now until now, after 56 years of being a human being. You'd think I would know what it's like to being a human being, but we don't know ourselves very much.
That process of understanding is what I see unfolding, at least in part, in the biblical stories, and it's halting and partial and awkward and contradictory and all of that, which is one of the things that makes the book so complex. But I see in it the struggle of humanity to rise above its animal forebears, say, and to become conscious of what it means to be human. And that's a very difficult thing, because we don't know who we are, what we are, where we came from, or any of those things. And, the life is an unbroken chain going back 3.5 billion years. It's an absolutely unbelievable thing. Every single one of your ancestors reproduced successfully for 3.5 billion years. It's absolutely unbelievable. We rose out of the dirt and the muck, and here we are, conscious but not knowing, and we're trying to figure out who we are. And a story that we've been telling, or a set of stories that we've been telling for 3,000 years, seems to me to have something to offer And so when I look at the stories in the Bible, I do it, I would say, in some sense, with a beginner's mind. It's a mystery, this book, how the hell it was made, why we preserved it, how it happened to motivate an entire culture for 2,000 years and to transform the world. Like, what's going on? How did that happen? It's by no means obvious. And one of the things that bothers me about casual critics of religion is that they don't take the phenomena seriously. And it's a serious phenomena. I mean, not least because people have the capacity for religious experience, and no one knows why that is. And I mean, you can induce it reliably in all sorts of different ways. You can do it with brain stimulation. You can certainly do it with drugs. There's especially the psychedelic variety. They produce intimations of the divine extraordinarily regularly. People have been using drugs like that for God only knows how long, 50,000 years, maybe more than that, to produce some sort of intimate union with the divine. It's like, we don't understand any of that when we...
Now, early on in my videos, you can find a video where I had a conversation about psychedelics with Dr. James Frazee, who's a member of our local meetup here, and then I read Michael Pollan's book on psychedelics, because when I started my videos on Jordan Peterson, I hadn't taken mushrooms. I still haven't taken mushrooms, but I don't drink alcohol or smoke. Why would I start doing psychedelic drugs, and how do they operate? We don't quite know how they operate, but when you get to this question of my connection between the frame problem and God, the fact is that James says, part of what these drugs do in terms of the brain is what they do is they sort of take the controls off. Well, what are these controls for? These controls are for filtering. Okay, so filtering all of this information. So there's way too much information out there than I can deal with. And so we have these filters, and part of these filters are biological. So my dog has filters on him that prioritizes certain aspects of the world. With his nose and his hearing. His eyesight isn't very good, but his nose is great and his hearing is great. And so he's prioritized to go out and do the kinds of dog things he needs to do in order to survive, and then have the kind of dog relationships within a pack that he needs in order to survive. And so all of that stuff is built into him, and we have stuff built into us too. And it seems like what these psychedelics do is take off the frame. And when we take off the frame, everything rushes in. And it's very interesting how this then so instinctively and natively gets associated with the divine. Well, there's a word, divine. Well, why do we choose that word? And why do psychedelics then suddenly transform just this moment where the frame is off, transform people in lasting ways? And Peterson himself, when he talks to what's his head over at Liberty University, and the one more question type little video he did after the big video where the guy rushed the stage. But why does this have lasting effects? Because and to me the it's an interesting idea that there's a potential association between these religious experiences when, in a sense, not only do we reliably induce them with drugs and doing things to your brain, religious communities have been reliably inducing them with music and meditation and sermons and song and conversations and reading and yeah, that's what religion has been playing with all along. And the fact that it gets associated with God or the divine or that which we have difficulty imagining or describing or representing, well, it makes sense that there's a connection between God and the frame problem and, the last few videos that I did.
We discovered the psychedelics in the late 60s. It shocked everybody so badly that they were instantly made illegal and abandoned in terms of research for like 50 years. And it's no wonder, because who the hell expected that? Nobody. Now,
there's a few people who've read Michael Pollan's book.
Now, Jung was a student of Nietzsche's, you see, and he was also, I would say, a very astute critic of Nietzsche. He was educated by Freud, and Freud, I suppose, in some sense, started to collate the information that we had pertaining to the notion that people lived inside a dream. It was Freud who really popularized the idea of the unconscious mind, and we take this for granted to such a degree today that we don't understand how revolutionary the idea was. Like with what's happened with Freud is that we've taken all the marrow out of his bones, so to speak, and left the husk behind. And now when we think about Freud, we just think about the husk because that's everything that's been discarded. But so much of what he discovered is part of our popular conception now, including the idea that your perceptions and your actions and your thoughts are all, what would you say, informed and shaped by unconscious motivations that are not part of your voluntary control. And that's a very, very strange thing. It's one of the most unsettling things about the psychoanalytic theories, because the psychoanalytic...
Well, not just about the psychoanalytic theories, but as a pastor, when you sit down with someone who's just done something horrible, that, this is Peterson at the edge of his bed, just done something horrible that he never wanted to do and never in the life thought he could do, and then he did it. Why did you do it? Well, Flip Wilson, the devil made me do it. There's a lot more to that joke than just a joke, because we have things inside of us that make us do things, and we don't know what to do about them, and that's disturbing for us. We would think we could just do what we say we're going to do or think we should do or tell everyone that everyone else should be doing. Tim Keller has this lovely little... it's an old pastor sermon illustration. You get these sermon illustrations where people say, well, I can't believe in a God who would judge me against his law. And so, well, imagine that, I'm going to update it with a cell phone. Imagine that your smartphone just suddenly clicks on everything you say every time you declare what someone else should do. And that every time you declare that, well, such and such a person should stop smoking, such and such a person should drive less, such and such a person should eat a certain way, such and such a person, this person should behave that way, and don't say those kinds of things to other people. What if your smartphone clicked on and recorded, Siri or Hey Google or whatever, recorded every time you gave an announcement about the morality of someone else, and then at Judgment Day, God just pulls it down from the cloud and says, then say, I'm not going to be judged by you. Say, okay. Well, why don't we have you judge yourself? Why don't you live by the standard that you imposed on everyone else in the world? That's essentially what Jesus says when he says, you shall not judge, because by the measure that you judge others, it will be applied to you. That's what Jesus says. And, well, who can meet that standard? Because we're so quick to put burdens on other people about their behavior that we don't want those burdens on us. That's how we are.
Analytic theories are something like, you're a loose collection of living sub-personalities, each with its own set of motivations and perceptions and emotions and rationales, all of that. And you have limited control over that. So you're like a plurality of internal personalities that's loosely linked into a unity. You know that because you can't control yourself very well, which is one of Jung's objections to Nietzsche's idea that we could create our own values. See, Jung didn't believe that, especially not after interacting with Freud, because he saw that human beings were...
Especially not after interacting with Freud. He looked at Freud and says, you can't control yourself. What about everybody else, you hypocrite?
affected by things that were deeply, deeply affected by things that were beyond their...
And if you want some fun reading, read Jung's chapter on Freud in Jung's autobiography. It's quite interesting.
Conscious control. And no one really knows how to conceptualize those things. The cognitive psychologists think about them in some sense as computational machines. And the ancient people, I think, thought of them as gods, although it's more complex than that. Like rage would be a god. Mars, the god of rage, that's the thing that possesses you when you're angry. It has a viewpoint and it...
He puts this out here, but that's really important what he says right there. That well, what are these gods? Well, because people don't know, and we don't use the word gods anymore, but we use spirit. And if you want to find an interesting thing in my adult Sunday school class, I did a couple of weeks on spirit because I talked to Adam about this as well, because schools have spirit. What do we mean when we say school spirit? Where does that spirit reside? Well, the intersubjective. Yeah, but it also gets into the building, and it gets into the stuff on the walls, and it even inhabits it after the students were gone. I did a conversation. It wasn't an online conversation. I had a conversation with an Uber driver who told me that this person loves to go to Europe. There's a certain cathedral in Italy that when this person goes there, the spirit just comes out of the walls. Well, what is that spirit? Oh, materialist. What is happening with this? What are these spirits that inhabit us? Oh, we're so skeptical about demon possession. Well, spirits inhabit us, and we're not in control of them. And if you want to see that, go to any playground and watch children. And for the most part, adults are barely socialized children in many ways.
It says what it wants to say, and that might have very little to do with what you want to say when you're being sensible. And it doesn't just inhabit you, it inhabits everyone, and it lives forever, and it even inhabits animals. And so it's this transcendent psychological entity that inhabits the body politic like a thought inhabits the brain. That's one way of thinking about it.
Now, and how do you deal with such things? Now, we get all embarrassed as secular people if we talk to them or even talk about them. We get embarrassed, but it doesn't seem to me that talking to them or about them isn't an entirely bad idea. Well, can they hear? Can they think? Well, how do you know? We don't even know what it is. But yet, it's out there and it controls us in some ways, or we wrestle with it. The Apostle Paul says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, these spirits or gods aren't flesh and blood, but they sure are real enough to make a mess out of our lives and make a mess out of the world.
It's a very strange way of thinking, but it certainly has its merits. And those things, well, in some sense, those are deities, although it's not that simple. And so Jung got very interested in dreams and started to understand the relationship between dreams and myths, because he would see in his clients' dreams echoes of stories that he knew because he was deeply read in mythology. And then he started to believe that the dream was the birthplace of the myth, and that there was a continual interaction between the two processes, the dream and the story, and storytelling. And, well, you tend to tell your dreams as stories when you remember them. And some people remember dreams all the time, like 2 or 3 a night. I've had clients like that, and they often have archetypal dreams that have very clear mythological structures. I think that's more the case with people who are creative, by the way, especially if they're a bit unstable at the time, because the dream tends to occupy the space of uncertainty and to concentrate on fleshing out the unknown reality before you get a real grip on it. So it's like the dream is the birthplace of thinking. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so because it's the birthplace of thinking, it's not that clear. It's doing its best to formulate something. That was Jung's notion, as opposed to Freud, who believed that there were sensors, internal sensors, that were hiding the dream's true message. That's not what Jung believed. He believed the dream was doing its best to express a reality that was still outside of fully articulated conscious comprehension. It was, because you think, look, a thought appears in your head, right? That's obvious. Bang, it's nothing you ever ask about. But what the hell does that mean? A thought appears in your head. What kind of ridiculous explanation is that? It just doesn't help with anything. Where does it come from? Well, nowhere. It just appears in my head. Okay, well, that's not a very sophisticated explanation, as it turns out, And so you might think that those thoughts that you think, well, where do they come from? Well, they're often someone else's thoughts, right? Someone long dead, that might be part of it, just like the words you use to think are utterances of people who've been long dead. And so you're informed by the spirit of your ancestors. That's one way of looking at it. And your motivations speak to you, and your emotions speak to you, and your body speaks to you. And it all does all that, at least in part, through the dream. And the dream is the birthplace of the fully articulated idea. They don't just come from nowhere fully fledged, right? They have a developmental origin, and God only knows how lengthy that origin is. Even to say something like, I am conscious, that's taken... Chimpanzees don't say that. It's been 7 million years since we broke from chimpanzees, something like that, from the common ancestor. They have no articulated knowledge at all. They have very little self-representation in some sense, and very little self-consciousness. And that's not the case with us at all. And we had to painstakingly figure all of this out during that, 7 million year voyage.
There's a book I've mentioned a few times, The Secret of Our Success, and that book starts with the question, well, are we so different from chimps because we're that much smarter? And it goes through various ideas. Even the question of intelligence is something which is part of the reason I like John's formulation of relevance realization, because I think it expands and broadens out intelligence to be the far more complex reality that it is. But it goes into this question of, well, are we really that much smarter than chimps or some of these things? And again, what seems to be, from the point of view of that book, the secret of our success is our capacity to think communally, to have a shared communal cognition. And if we're going to have this shared communal cognition, one might ask, well, how does this happen? And I think Peterson is right here, where it happens with us watching each other, and then we have language, and so we listen to each other. And so when Brett Weinstein in his talk with Alistair McGrath says, what's the difference between man and chimps? Language is just the beginning of it, because it's not just language. And I'm not saying that he reduced it to it. Poor guy had to give an answer on stage in front of cameras and all that stuff. That's not easy, but it's language is just the beginning of it. And so this idea that, well, what if it's in kind of the dreams around us? And so once you start thinking this way, you're not far off of Jung's collective unconscious. Although I don't know if that's the best way to represent it verbally for us, but it is unconscious and it is collective, but it's dreamlike, and it has content, and its content is coded in images and narratives and sound bites and music. One of the things that I've told this story before, as a pastor, you get invited into spaces that aren't terribly public, and there was a situation where a man was dying, and sometimes people just kind of die quietly, and sometimes people don't. And this was a case where the man was not dying quietly, and he had an estranged wife and kids with his estranged wife, but he hadn't actually divorced her. And so, okay, there's a legal mess. So now she's the one who's making medical decisions for her estranged husband. And some of the kids were from her, and some of the kids weren't from her. And I'm in the waiting room with various elements of various family members. And we've all been in the other room where he's not dying a very peaceful death. And the estranged wife embraces her brother. Both of them were adopted. And again, as a pastor, you kind of see a lot more from families in terms of the generations. And they embraced, and they began to sing together a song. It wasn't a religious song at all. In fact, in some ways, it was kind of a campy song, nostalgic, but it meant a lot to the both of them because they grew up together, and they knew this song together. And so the song creates something between them in that space. And again, well, how do you code the estranged husband dying an unpeaceful death, and the fragmented children he had left through various women, and all of those relationships, and then this last estranged wife, and the utter complexity of the at one point happy and later broken home that they had created, and the children that were left in that, and how does that get encoded? How do you survive that? Because we're not just, I remember the chimp lady. I don't remember Jane Goodall, and it was so moving to people when people saw chimps grieve. Yeah, but we're operating on all these other layers, and so we have to process that. We have to encode it. Well, how do we do it? Well, it's I think Peterson's got a handle on it with this, with the dreams and the images, and we're living in the midst of that. And that's why we conjure all of this stuff, and we're mysteries to ourselves, because we're so enormously complicated, and life for us has so many more levels than life has for my dog. And we've got to manage it on all of those levels. And so all of the complexity, and then in all of that complexity, all of the messes we make, we have to deal with it. And therapists sit in rooms with strangers and talk for hours and hours at $100 or $200 an hour, pulling all of this stuff apart, and you can do it forever. It's just that complex. And that's a relatively new thing for very wealthy people to be able to afford. And most of the world just has alcohol or music or church or anything else to get by, because these things in our minds just won't be denied. And this is part of the reason that I'm with Peterson, and that to say that this is just a world of objects and that we're just walking around seeing stuff and interacting stuff, that's not what people are like. And when I hear people deal with that and talk about that, I think, have you never met a human being? Don't you know what we're like? That one word that your mother said to you 40 years ago still lingers in your mind, and it's affected your relationship with your wife or your daughter or your coworkers, and maybe it's been something you've been drinking yourself to death over. That's what we're like. So yeah, the idea of God, this isn't going away. It's way too useful. We need a platform. We need characters in that platform. That's the stuff of religion. This is what we've been working on forever. It's our operating system for our cultures. It doesn't just go away. The new ideas just add to it. They don't dispel it.
And I think some of that's represented and captured in some sense in these ancient stories, which I believe were part of especially the oldest stories in Genesis, which is the stories we're going to start with, that
these are battle-hardened stories. These are stories that have been compressed down and down and down, and Peterson will talk about it into just a few verses. So all of this stuff into just a few verses, and of course the text itself on the page and how that is mined has on the matter of paper and parchment and stone and all the ancient ways that it was remembered.
Some of the archaic nature of the human being is encapsulated in those stories, and it's very, very instructive as far as I can tell. I can give you just a quick example. There's an idea of sacrifice in the Old Testament, and it's pretty barbaric. The story.
Oh, when I get into Girard, we're going to talk a lot about sacrifice.
The story of Abraham and Isaac is a good example of that, because Abraham is called on to actually sacrifice his own son, which doesn't really seem like something that a reasonable God would ask you to do, right? And the God in the Old Testament is.
And again, when he says that a reasonable God, there's so much stuff built into that word God that we can barely use it. And so again, the prohibition of using the name of God, the more I learn and the more I go, the more I think, yeah, there's way more built into that than we ever give credit for. We're not very wise creatures.
Frequently cruel and arbitrary and demanding and paradoxical, and which is one of the things that really gives the book life, because it wasn't edited by a committee, a committee that was concerned with not offending anyone, that's for sure. So Jung believed that the dream was the birthplace of thought. And I've been extending that idea because one of the things I wondered about deeply was, you have a dream.
Thought or God?
And then So Jung believed that the dream was the birthplace of thought.
Thought. For Jung, I imagine he'd say God too.
And I've been extending that idea because one of the things I wondered about deeply was, you have a dream and then someone interprets it You can argue about whether or not an interpretation is valid, just like you can argue about whether your interpretation of a novel or movie is valid, right?
Or a biblical text.
Right? It's a very difficult thing to determine with any degree of accuracy, which accounts in part for the postmodern critique. But my observation has been that people will present a dream, and sometimes we can extract out real useful information from it that the person didn't appear to know. And they get a flash of insight, and to me...
And again, they didn't appear to know. Well, what do we mean by that word? It wasn't there on in their consciousness room on the shelf that they could pull off and say. It's this insight that comes, and again, this is part of this propositional nature where we propose it out there from ourselves so we can look at it, and so the dream, in a sense, transmits out there, and so now we can look at it and we can work on it.
That's a marker that we've stumbled on something that unites part of that person that wasn't united before. It pulls things together, which is often what a good story will do, or sometimes a good theory. Things snap together for you, and there's a little light goes on, and that's one of the markers.
That's a little Kramer-esque moment. So sorry to the podcasters. I'm going to replay it because it just looks a little bit like Cosmo Kramer there with the hand gesture.
Which is often what a good story will do, or sometimes a good theory. Things snap together for you, and there's a little
right there.
Little light goes on, and that's one of the markers that I've used for accuracy in dreams. And I know in my own family, when I was first married, I'd have fights with my wife, arguments about this and that, and I'm fairly hot-headed, and so I'd get all puffed up and, agitated about whatever we were arguing about, and she'd go to sleep, which was really annoying, so annoying, because I couldn't sleep, right? I was like chewing off my fingernails, and she...
Now there's this movie out, Rise, it's at some point going to be out on Apple, and it's about Peterson, and part of what's fun about that movie is there's a lot of video just from his family life, and if you're interested in Peterson, it's sort of interesting to watch, just because again, we watch each other carefully, and not just our conscious selves watch, but the whole, all of our mind watches, and we filter it, and we get ideas about people, and so it's, for Peterson fans out there, it's interesting to see.
She'd be like sleeping peacefully beside me. It's like maddening. So, but often she'd have a dream, and then the next morning she'd discuss it with me, and then we could unravel what was at the bottom of our argument, and that was unbelievably useful, even though it was extraordinarily aggravating. So I was convinced by Jung. It looked to me like his ideas about the relationship between dreams and mythology and drama and literature. It made sense to me, and the relationship between that and art. I know this native carver. He's a Kwakwaka'wakw guy. He's carved a bunch of wooden sculptures.
And apparently that movie, Jonathan Peugeot made this comment, that movie that they made was because of the relationship between he and that carver. And then all of the craziness broke out with C16 while they were working on it. And so it's like, whew, now you got some footage there, baby.
Totem poles and masks that I have in my house. And he's a very interesting person. Not literate, not particularly literate, and really still steeped in this ancient 13,000-year-old tradition. He's an original language speaker, and the fact that he isn't literate has sort of left him with the mind of someone who's pre-literate, and pre-literate people aren't stupid, they're just not literate, so their brains are organized differently in many ways. And I've asked him about his intuition for his carvings, and he's told me that he dreams, like you've seen the Haida masks, you know what they look like. Well, his people are closely related to the Haida, so it's the same kind of style. He said he dreams in those animals and can remember his dreams, and he also talks to his grandparents who taught him how to carve in his dreams. Quite often, if he runs into a problem with carving, his grandparents will come and he'll talk to them, but he sees that.
And again, from a psychological perspective, which is of course what Peterson, he hasn't started giving all the qualifications in this video yet, because he doesn't actually get into the biblical text. From a psychological perspective, this of course makes perfect sense. If you imagine that what your brain has to do is represent all of what you're interacting with somehow in some kind of narrative language that that dreams fit in very nicely into that idea of what we need to do.
The creatures that he's going to carve living in an animated sense in his imagination. And I mean, it's not that difficult. First of all, I have no reason to disbelieve him. He's a very, very straightforward person, and he doesn't have the motivation or the guile, I would say, in some sense, to invent a story like that. There's just no reason he would possibly do it. I don't think he's told that many people about it. He thinks it's kind of crazy, you know. He said when he was a kid, he thought he was insane because he'd had those dreams all the time.
Now, that sounds like a throwaway line, but it really isn't. Because, again, it gets back to my point where we judge its status. We judge our status. We judge our sanity. It's you know, so Peterson, when he's having his conversations with Sam Harris on those videos, is and when I was listening to him, I always, again, this is our cultural default. I always think in individualistic terms, but our filters are communal, which is why church is so important, because we filter them throughout our community. And if a human being is isolated from other human beings, they go insane. Why? Because our filters are actually communal. And well, what are the filters, and how is this information encoded? Well, it's encoded in the looks and the sounds. And again, watch yourself in a relationship with someone that you know well. Look at a married couple that have been married for 40 or 50 years. You know, even a silent moment at a particular time speaks volumes. Think about your relationship with your parents, and you know them so well, possibly, at least if you know you grew up with them, and it's all encoded. And so we're highly communal in all these ways, and I think this is a blind side of our culture, that we don't respect the fact of how communal we are and how much stuff this matters and how this gets encoded.
About these creatures and so forth. And so it wasn't something he was trumpeting, but I found it fascinating because I can see in him part of the manifestation of this unbroken tradition. We have no idea how traditions like that are really passed along for thousands and thousands of years, right?
Just like we don't know how things are encoded between us in any moment.
Part of it's oral and memory, part of it's acted out and dramatized, and then part of it's going to be imaginative. And people who aren't literate, they store information quite differently than we do. We don't remember anything. It's all written down in books, right? But if you're from an oral culture, especially if you're trained in that way, you have all of that information at hand, both so you can speak it, you can tell the stories, and you really know them. And you know, modern people don't really know what that's like anymore. I doubt if there's more than maybe two of you in the audience that could spout from memory like a 30-line poem. You know, and poetry was written so that people could do that.
And this has changed dramatically, quickly. I remember as a child sitting around, and my father he'd have these poems in his head from when he learned them in school. Well, what kind of a school did my father grow up on? My grandfather had churches out in the prairie. And so my father would go to these tiny little schools, and the education, which again, styles of education change, all of this stuff. The education then was a lot of rote. And so as a child, he learned certain poems. And around the dinner table when I was a child, every now and then my father was fairly playful mentally. He would just come out with a certain poem or a certain song. And as a kid, I always thought, that's the randomest song I've ever heard of, but it was Tales from Another Place. But most of human history, that was the way. When we lived in the Dominican Republic, my wife was helping out a school, and the schools that had Dominican teachers, well, those teachers, in many ways, the education that they received was the first draft of the education that they were going to give. And so a lot of this education was rote. When I'd go into the churches, we'd come in as North Americans, and we would have this priority. Well, here's a verse from the Bible, put it in your own words. And there's reasons for that. But the older tradition was, here's a verse for the Bible, spit it back out at me just like you had it. And so in the Sunday school classes in the Haitian churches, there'd be these long sections of the pastor would say a verse, and everyone would repeat back, and the pastor would say another, and everyone would repeat back. Well, what are they doing? As a community, they are memorizing the sacred words, and they are keeping them alive, because who knows what will happen to books in an unstable, chaotic community, and there might even only be one book. And so, in a sense, in that very impoverished Haitian community, they are practicing the kinds of rehearsing the kinds of practices that kept religious communities alive for generation after generation through unspeakable chaos and violence. And they didn't know why they were doing it. They just did it because they had done it before. And that's what people are like. We do things that we don't know why we're doing. And it's a good thing we do because, well, we can apply Darwinian type thinking to this, because communities that didn't do it are no longer with us. And they were colonized by communities that did do it, and the practices evolved and were sustained and took over.
That's why we have that form, is so that people could remember it and have it with them. And we don't do any of that anymore. Anyways, back to you.
We don't do any of that anymore because we've had this nice window, and again, these windows are tiny, 50, 100, 200 years of relative stability. Put our lives through a blender, we'll probably start doing it again.
Jung was a great believer in the dream, and I noted that dreams will tell you things that you don't know. And then I thought, well, how the hell can that be? How that in the world can something you think up tell you something you don't know? How does that make any sense?
Now, just as a preacher, listening to Peterson talk, he's a lot like a preacher, because you notice how he makes a point, does this little interesting circuit, comes back to the same point. This is all preacher craft, and I don't know if he knows what he's doing. And I'd love to know who preached at him when he was a little boy out in that United Church of Canada church.
First of all, why don't you understand it? Why does it have to come forth in the form of the dream? It's like there's something going on inside you that you don't control, right? The dream happens to you just like life happens to you. I mean, there is the odd lucid dreamer who can, apply a certain amount of conscious control, but most of the time you're laying there asleep, and this crazy, complicated world manifests itself inside you, and you don't know how. You can't do it when you're awake, and you don't know what it means. It's like, what the hell's going on? And that's one of the things that's so damn frightening about the psychoanalysts, because you get this both from Freud and Jung. You really start to understand that there are things inside you that are happening that control you instead of the other way around. There's a bit of reciprocal control, but there's manifestations of spirits, so to speak, inside you that determine the manner in which you walk through life, and you don't control it.
And what's amazing to me, and the points he's making here are just exactly right. What's amazing to me is that people don't recognize this. And again, I watch people, as a pastor, live, and it's like, yeah, that's how we are. No, not me. It's like, really? Let me get a video camera. Let me give some illustrations of how you're just like that.
And what does? Is it random? There are people who have claimed that dreams are merely the consequence of random neuronal firing, which is a theory I think is absolutely absurd, because there's nothing random about dreams. They're very, very structured and very, very complex, and they're not like snow on a television screen or static on a radio. Like, those things are complicated. And then also I've seen so often that people have very coherent dreams that have a perfect narrative structure. They're fully developed in some sense. And so that theory just doesn't go anywhere with me. I just can't see that as useful at all. And so I'm more likely to take the phenomena seriously and say, well, there's something to dreams. Well, you dream of the future and then you try to make it into a reality. That seems to be an important thing. Or maybe you dream up a nightmare and try to make that into a reality, because people do that too if they're hell-bent on revenge, for example, and full of hatred and resentment.
Or you have something happen in your life and you say, I think I dreamed this. What's with that? Now, again, we'll put it on science. Well, you can't tell me what I dreamed, and maybe I'm just deluding myself, or maybe it's a false thought. But even the dynamic of that thought, what's with that?
That manifests itself in terrible fantasies. Those are dreams, then people go act them out. These things are powerful, and whole nations can get caught up in collective dreams. That's what happened to the Nazis. That's what happened to Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
Well, he's using dreams metaphorically there, but the fact that that we use that word metaphorically in that way is very interesting and very telling, because most of the dreams we have are not this, if are not what you would answer when I ask you, what do you really want? You don't. Our dreams are usually far more, my dreams at least, are usually far more chaotic. Every now and then there'll be a really nice dream, but the other normal dreams are just sort of this and that and this and that, and usually some frustration and some challenge and all of that. So, the fact that we use dreams in a particular way, as he just used it here, that's a very interesting thing.
It's absolutely remarkable, amazing, horrific, destructive spectacle. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union. The same thing happened in China. It's like, we have to take these things seriously, and try to understand what's going on. So Jung believed that the dream could contain
back to Jung,
more information than was yet articulated. You think artists do the same thing, like people go to museums and they look at paintings, Renaissance paintings or modern paintings, and they don't exactly know why they're there. I was in this room in New York.
And again, this has everything to do with value. But why? How do we communally? I mean, that's really, in a sense, what status is. We communally assess value, and we act that out, and we communicate that to us, and we signal it, and we're that's terribly powerful and terribly real for us. I might up the speed on this video. I don't know, because I've listened to these videos so many times. At least this early one I've listened to a lot.
I don't remember which museum, but it was a room full of Renaissance art, great painters, the greatest painters, and I thought maybe that room was worth $1 billion or something outrageous because there was like 20 paintings in there, so priceless. And the first thing is, well, why are those paintings worth so much? And why is there a museum in the biggest city in the world devoted to them? And why do people from all over the world come and look at them? What the hell are those people doing? One of them was of the Assumption of Mary, beautifully painted, absolutely glowing work of art, and there's like 20 people standing in front of it looking at it and think, what are those people up to? They don't know. Why did they make a pilgrimage to New York to come and look at that painting? It's not like they know. Why is it worth so much? I mean, I know there's a status element to it too, but that begs the question. Why do those items become such high status items? What?
Right, because status is just simply another currency of value.
What is it about them that's so absolutely remarkable? Well, we're strange creatures. So I was trying to figure out in part, well, where did the information that's in the dream come from? Because it has to come from somewhere, and you could think about it as a revelation. Because it's like it springs out of the void and it's new knowledge and it's a revelation. You didn't produce it.
Now, his use of the word revelation there, maybe I'll slow it down again. His use of the word revelation there is really interesting because, well, what do we mean by a revelation? Well, it has to do with value and status, and it has to do with value and status, the regard with which we hold this element of information as compared to other elements of information that we live with. And it's funny, I listen to the celebrity atheists go on and on about the Bible and supernatural and la 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 and Revelation, and it's like, yeah, but you have various different elements have different revelatory status for you. You might not believe that the Bible is revelation, but you might believe that. Well, see, part of the problem with these other, with people who don't have a religion and don't have a communally sanctioned book in which there's a communal tradition around an idea such as revelation, is that you don't really have one. What you really have is a bunch of ideas that you sort of hold up, but you haven't really encoded them, and so they stay rather murky. And believe me, the Bible, even with itself as a text, is plenty murky for people, because if you watch people and listen to people read the Bible and try to interpret the Bible, you'll very quickly see that there's a world of murkiness going on, even amidst. It's almost worse amidst professional interpreters of the book, because we know so much more. It sort of tightens the rules. But this revelatory status that we use to regard certain parts of information, that's an entire dynamic that deserves attention in and of itself. But Peterson's use of it's a revelation is, I think, fit in that we're talking about the idea of God. So we're going to have an idea of revelation, that something happens and suddenly lights come on. Look at the language we use, and I can see clearly, and things are illuminated, and I am enlightened. Look at all of the ways that we use to talk about that. So, it's not a bad word, but it's at these points that religious traditions, that Peterson starts hitting some tripwires for people within a religious tradition. And that's perfectly justified and good, because what religious communities do set up are tripwires in order so that the members of the religious community can function as a community. Because what is a community? A community is a group of individuals that now have communal ways of acting and thinking so that many can act as one. Okay? That's in fact how people come together and become as one. And if you don't have that capacity and you don't have the framework for communities to come together as one, you can't accomplish the kinds of things in the world through time and history that these principalities can in fact accomplish, because many tens, hundreds, dozens, thousands of people become as one. That changes the world. And in a sense, what happens with the loss and the rejection of these mechanics that are used in order to create human community, well, what happens is that you lose power. What do you mean, who's you? You singular or plural. Another problem in English that we have you don't have it in Greek or or Spanish, but the second person is singular and plural is the same. So if you're within an institution, within a community that has tripwires and all of these things, again, as individualist libertarian Americans, we sort of Spanish words always come to my mind when I start thinking in some of these terms. We always cast away these ideas, but they're incredibly powerful, and we do so at our peril.
It just appears. But one of the things I want to do with this series is, like, I am scientifically minded and I'm quite a rational person, and I like to have an explanation for things that's rational and empirical before I look for any other kind of explanation. And I don't want to say that everything that's associated with divinity can be reduced in some manner to biology or to an evolutionary history or anything like that. But
this is part of his open agnostic posture for this.
Insofar as it's possible to do that reduction, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to leave the...
And again, if you get into some of the videos I made a couple of months ago about the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse, what seems clear in this combinatorially explosive world is that you can continue to penetrate with the spirit of geometry, with reason, and try things out. And I think Christians sometimes develop a fear that, you're going to get to the curtain and pull it back and find the humbug Wizard of Oz. I think we need not have that fear.
The other phenomena floating in the air, because they can't be pinned down, and in that category I would put the category of mystical or religious experience, which we don't understand at all. So artists observe one another. They observe people and they represent what they see, and they transmit the message of what they see to us, and they teach us to see, and we don't necessarily know what it is that we're learning from them. But
And again, I'm thinking about the movie The Joker that's coming out, and I've talked to a number of filmmakers in my process here, and I think Peterson's right in terms of this process and how this works.
We're learning something, or at least we're acting like we're learning something. We go to movies, we watch stories, we immerse ourselves in fiction constantly. That's an artistic production. And for many people, the world of the arts is a living world, and that's particularly true if you're a creative person. And it's the creative, artistic people that do move the knowledge of humanity forward, and they do that with their artistic productions first. They're on the edge, and the dancers do that, and the poets do that, and the visual artists do that, and the musicians do that, and we're not sure what they're doing. Like, we're not sure what musicians are doing. What the hell are they doing? Why do you like music? It gives you a deep intimation of the significance of things. And no one questions it. You go to a concert, you're thrilled. It's a quasi-religious experience, particularly if the people really get themselves together and get the crowd moving. You know, there's something incredibly intense about it, but it makes no sense whatsoever. It's not an easy thing to understand. Music is deeply patterned, and patterned in layers, and I think that has something to do with it, because reality is patterned and deeply patterned in layers, and so I think music is representing reality in some fundamental way, and that we get into the sway of that and sort of participate in being, and that's part of what makes it such an uplifting experience. But we don't really know that's what we're doing. We just go do it, and it's nourishing for people, right? I mean, young people in particular.
And nourishing, interesting choice of words, and the right word. But what do we mean nourishing unto what? Nourishing unto, and this is where you get into Peterson's sort of using meaning as an internal compass, and this intuitive sense of value that we have, which is by no means infallible. It's constantly gets tricked and bullshitted, but no, it's just.
Lots of them live for music. It's where they derive all their meaning, their cultural identity. Everything that's nourishing comes from their affiliation with their music and is part of their cultural identity. So that's an amazing thing. The question still remains, where does the information in dreams come from? And I think where it comes from is that we watch the patterns that everyone acts out. We've watched that forever, and we've got some representation.
Again, "we" is interesting when he uses it there.
Of those out. We've watched that forever, and we've got some representations of those patterns. That's part of our cultural history. That's what's embedded in stories, in fictional accounts of the story between good and evil, the bad guy and the good guy, and the romance. You know, these are canonical patterns of being for people, and they deeply affect us because they represent what it is that we will act out in the world.
And we have a sense when we watch them that they're useful to us. And again, that's a deep part of it, that we're fascinated by it. Even you would think, well, why would watching this movie about superheroes or space people or some intimate the complexities of a relationship of this couple, that it's a fictitious couple that I'll never know. Well, why is that interesting to me? That somewhere in our brains are saying, well, you're going to need to watch this. You're going to learn something from this, and this might be important, so pay attention.
And then we flesh that out with the individual information we have about ourselves and other people. And so it's like there's waves of behavioral patterns that manifest themselves in the crowd across time. The great dramas are played on the crowd across time, and the artists watch that. And
it's helpful to remember that the people who are playing it out have also watched things. And so when you think about, let's say, compression, data compression that happens in. This doesn't happen so much anymore because we have these big hard drives and a lot of RAM, but 10, 15, 20 years ago, you know, you would compress a WAV file, which was really too big for your hard drive, into an MP3, and that was lossy. And so then what we did is, you know, now we have lossless compression. But so it's the constantly watching okay, we watch this love story with these people. Now we watch it with these people. We watch it with these people. And we watch these superheroes. We watch these superheroes. We watch these superheroes. What we're doing is we're synthesizing out the lessons. And again, we don't know we're doing it. It's just all happening in our minds. We're synthesizing. It's getting compressed and refined and focused. And actually, when you get to, again, cross over into some of the Vervaeke stuff, what comes out of there finally is wisdom. Because we've compressed so many things, and because everyone else is watching too, and so you have this communal cognition that is compressing in wisdom. So then you have all these wisdom strands that are out there, and we're looking at all the wisdom strands, and then here's a wisdom strand: drink yourself to sleep at night every night. Okay, you play that over 1,000 people, and you got all these alcoholics. It's not a very good one. Oh, take this drug. Lots of people, that's not a very good one. And so wisdom is part of this compilation and this refining and this compression that happens over and over and over again. And it gets tried and tested and through all the stories. And so, what's happening now with the the incredible multiplicity of artificial stories that we're living with Netflix and stories on our phones and on and on and on. Well, I don't know. Is corrupt data getting played out? That would be propaganda, I suppose. Or is it honest data? Is this helping us? I don't know. How are we supposed to know? And the thing is, again, back to the Bible and all of this, what the Bible is in many ways is that, again, says Peterson, that process just built into that. Now, Christians say, well, this is from God. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that this is canon. This is prioritized. Now, modern people look at that and say, yeah, but some of the letters and some of the texts, it's like, no, you're not getting it. You're not getting it.
They get intimations of what that is, and they write it down and they tell us, and then we're a little clearer about what we're up to. You know, like a great dramatist like Shakespeare, let's say, we know that what he wrote is fiction, and then we say, well, fiction isn't true. But then you think, well, wait a minute, maybe it's true like numbers are true. You know, numbers are an abstraction from the underlying reality, but no one in their right mind would really think numbers aren't true. You could even make a case that the numbers are more real than the things that they represent, right? Because the abstraction is so insanely powerful. Once you have mathematics, you're just deadly. You can move the world with mathematics.
Now, he says more insanely powerful. He could have said more insanely real.
So it's not obvious that the abstraction is less real than the more concrete reality. And you take a work of fiction like Hamlet and you think, well, is that... It's not true because it's fiction, but then you think, wait a minute, what kind of explanation is that? Like maybe it's more true than nonfiction, because it takes the story that needs to be told about you and the story that needs to be told about you and you and you and you, and abstracts that out and says, look, here's something that's a key part of the human experience as such, right? So it's an abstraction from this underlying noisy substrate, and people are affected by it because they see.
Now, noise is a really interesting word he uses there too, because again, if we continue with this metaphor of data compression, noise and data compression, well, what is noise? Noise is sort of like weeds. Well, what are weeds in a garden? Is the weed any less a plant than the other plant? Is the weed any less a valuable plant? The word noise is a word that communicates a function of value. The word weed is a word that communicates a function of value. It's noise to us. We talk a signal to noise ratio. Noise is that which we don't want. Okay? And so, let me back him up a little bit.
The substrate and people be part of the human experience as such, right? So it's an abstraction from this underlying noisy substrate, and people are affected by it because they see that the thing that's represented is part of the pattern of their being. That's the right way to think about it. And then with these old stories, these ancient stories, it seems to me like that process has been occurring for thousands of years. It's like we watched ourselves and we extracted out some stories. We imitated each other and we represented that in drama, and then we distilled the drama and we got a representation of the distillation, and then we did it again, and at the end of that process,
that's the compression. It's compressed and compressed and compressed.
It took God only knows how long. I think some of these stories, they've traced fairy tales back 10,000 years, some fairy tales, in relatively unchanged form. And it certainly seems to me that the archaeological evidence, for example, suggests that the really old stories that the Bible begins with are at least that old and likely embedded in a prehistory that's far older than that. And you might think, well, how can you be so sure? And the answer to that in part is that cultures that don't change, like the ancient cultures, right? They didn't change as fast as us. They stay the same.
I love that line.
That's like the ancient cultures, right? They didn't change as fast as us. They stay the same. That's the answer.
And it's the Haitians with their practice. They don't change partly because of the chaos. They're not free to change, and they have to keep doing this, or the culture just evaporates. And so what you get is, well, you get the most durable cultures. Does that mean they're the best cultures? Well, you're going to have some ideas about. You're going to have some guiding stars out there something outside. And the question, of course, of secularism is there an outside?
So they keep their information moving generation to generation. That's how they stay the same. And so we know, again, in the archaeological record, there are records of rituals that have remained relatively unbroken for up to 20,000 years. It was discovered in caves in Japan that were set up for a particular kind of bear worship that was also characteristic of Western Europe. So these things can last for very long periods of time. We're watching each other act in the world. And then the question is, well, how long have we been watching each other? And the answer to that, in some sense, is, well, as long as there's been creatures with nervous systems. And that's a long time, that's some hundreds of millions of years, perhaps longer than that. We've been watching each other, trying to figure out what we're up to across that entire span of time. And some of that knowledge is built right into our bodies, which is why we can dance with each other, for example, right? Because understanding isn't just something that you have as an abstraction, it's something that you act out, That's what children are doing when they're learning to rough and tumble play, is they're learning to integrate their body with the body of someone else in a harmonious way, learning to cooperate and compete, and that's all instantiated right into their body. It's not abstract knowledge. They don't know that they're doing that, they're just doing it. And so we can even use our body as a representational platform.
And again, it gets funny into this, what do we mean by know? They don't know that they're doing this, they're just doing this. Well, part of them knows that they're doing this. It's this little conscious part that we connect with them. Again, this is identity. That part doesn't know, but they know, they're doing it, so they must know something.
So we've been studying each other for a long time, abstracting out what is it that we're up to, and that's what is it we're up to? What should we be up to? That's even a more fundamental question. If you're going to live in the world and you're going to do it properly, what does properly mean, and how is it that you might go about that?
And to what end? Now we've got telos coming in here.
Well, it's the right question, right? It's what everyone wants to know. How do you live in the world? Not what is the world made of. It's not the same question. How do you live in the world? It's the eternal question of human beings. And I guess we're the only species that has ever really asked that question, because all the other animals, they just go and do whatever they do. Not us. It's a question for us. We have to become aware of it. We have to be able to speak it. God only knows why. But that seems to be the situation. So we act. That acting is shaped by the world. That acting is shaped by society into something that we don't understand, but that we can model. We model it in our stories. We model it with our bodies. And that's where the dream gets its information. The dream is part of the process that's watching everything and then trying to formulate it and trying to say, trying to get the signal out from the noise and to portray it in dramatic form, because a dream is a little drama.
Now get the signal out from the noise. Well, how do we know what's signal and what's noise? Because it's all just data. Now we're getting to Vervaeke's relevance realization, because it's relevance, this thing that John says doesn't have an essence. That's the little tuning that we're always doing. This is relevant, this is not. This is relevant, this is not. And then we discover, we got it wrong. Time to recode. Then we watch others doing all this relevance realization, and they get it wrong. Time to recode. And we're always adjusting, always recalibrating, always signal and noise, because there's way too much data.
And then you get the chance to talk about what that dream is. And then you have it.
That's the process.
You have something like articulated knowledge at that point. And so the Bible, I would say, it exists in that space that's half into the dream and half into articulated knowledge. It's something like that. And going into it to find out what the stories are about it can aid our self-understanding. And then the other issue is that if Nietzsche was correct, and if Dostoevsky
but before he goes on, excuse me, I just have to hit the space button. Crazy world. This is going to, again, trip a lot of... So, again, he's talking from below here. All right? This is his project. It's in a sense, a sort of natural theology up from below. Let's give a psychological explanation to account for not just the creation of this book, but the culture that is around the book, because the book isn't just, I get, dozens of them up on the shelf here. The book isn't just the physical thing. That's not really the book. The book is everything around it, and the publishing houses, and people sneaking it into Russia or China and reading it every day and having this relationship with it. That's the book, that whole thing. And now, let's say a skeptic might look at this and say, oh, well, this is all this encoding for wisdom and so on and so forth, which is giving the Bible credibility, which is being communicated to people for whom the Bible had no credibility. And so look at Jordan Peterson, and he has credibility, and he talks about the Bible, and he argues persuasively that the Bible should have credibility, so they then give it credibility. Well, if you wanted to encode that in religious language, what would it look like? Well, it would look like the religious encoded language that we have. We don't have any other way to encode it besides that. If we say something like, well, the Bible is a good book and you should read it. Well, you might say, well, yeah, but there's lots of good books that are on my shelf. Here's this book from Timothy Keller, and here's this book from Jordan Peterson, and here's this book from Timon Hoffman about Canadian story of the CRC, and here's this book by G.K. Beale of the temple and the church's mission. And oh boy, we got lots of books. Well, it's not just a good book, it's the best book. There's a priority. And well, what kind of language would you use? Well, that's where all the religion get its languages from. Now, of course, celebrity atheists come along and say, but it's not that special. It's not inspired by God. Well, how do you know? You don't. You're skeptical about it. But then again, I watch non-religious people talk about how they imagine religious people deal with the text. Well, I've been watching religious people deal with the text my whole life, and they deal with it in very particular ways. They read certain segments of it a lot, and 90% of it they don't read at all. And this, again, I really like what Brett Weinstein said in the Alistair McGrath conversation, and I made this point a while ago with my videos. The beauty of having it all on YouTube is if you could ever actually find it, you could actually find it. But it's so most of the Bible sort of lies dormant for many people, just like our genetic code, and then people just keep coming back to certain codes, and maybe those codes produce proteins, and those proteins are the confessions and the doctrines, and those proteins then become active in the body of the church, and that's how. But in different cultures, different proteins become active, but then those churches meet each other and figure out, well, these passages say this and those passages say this, and they're both from the Bible that we both agree are up at the top of the hierarchy. So how do we manage that? And then it gets into the area of confessions, and this is actually how people work. Okay, and so this process that Jordan is talking about. The Bible itself is not simply the result of this process. Now, again, I'm Dutch Calvinist, and you can read someone like Herman Bavinck and learn about what we call organic inspiration of the text, that God moved authors, and so that particular understanding of the origin and nature of Scripture is not alien to our doctrinal theological tradition. But that process has not ended. And if you look at my Sunday school classes, one of the things that I often do is I bring in different translations of the Bible, and we'll dig back into the King James Version from the 16th century, and then we'll look at the New International Version, first developed in like 1975 and updated in 2011, and then I'll look at these different traditions, and we'll look at the text, because that continues to happen. It's a living document amidst a living community, and the community is strengthened because it has such a document. Because if you don't have this document, communities have a very difficult time coming together, forming Voltron, as it were, but not just of like 5 lion robots, but thousands and millions of people. And this, of course, in a political sense, is what the U.S. Constitution is supposed to do. And so if we look in Western society and we say, oh, they're using a book and a text around which to organize and to maintain themselves, well, someone would say, well, isn't that what religious people do? Politics is just following religion. And the fact that we're using a book, a text in that way and trying to organize people together in that way. Where did we get that idea? Well, we saw it worked with the Bible, so let's write a constitution and see how that goes. And the older the constitution gets, the more we're, don't want to tinker with it. Because when you write a new constitution, it's all chaos, and usually only do that after some great tragedy or some great victory. So I'm running out of time. We'll see how this goes. I'll listen to a little bit more, and then we'll see.
Jung was correct, and Dostoevsky as well. Without the cornerstone that understanding provides, we're lost. And that's not good, because then we're susceptible to psychic pathology. That's psychological pathology. The people who are adamant anti-religious thinkers seem to believe that if we abandoned our immersement in the underlying dream, that we'd all instantly become rationalists like Descartes or Bacon, or intelligent, clear-thinking, rational, scientific people.
And what they never seem to realize is that Descartes and Bacon had that underpinning, which afforded them rationality. And again, as I played that little clip from Rene Girard, what's happened in our society is that we've simply forgotten the underpinning. And the further you get away from the underpinning, the more and more chaos gets built in. Well, now my video seems to have stopped up there, so maybe I'll call this a wrap.